Hello, my name is Daniel, and this video is all about the GPU chip as seen here and the CPU chip as seen here. You notice this dust buildup. This is 98% of the cause of all your red light issues. The airflow is blocked from traveling through the heat sinks, causing the chips beneath to run excessively hot. You must keep your box clean and free of dust. This will not only crystallize and crack solder joints beneath your chips, but it will also dry out the thermal paste that transfers the heat from the chip to the heat sink. Now, because I have so many people screaming at me, threatening to sue me, even though I tell them to go for it because I love the publicity and I'd love to countersue them and make them pay back and buy new boxes for everybody they've screwed up. Anyway, I have decided to draw a picture and show you what is going on. So let's start here. In this video illustration, I have provided a heat sink, a chip, the motherboard, the case, and another component here, and a rough drawing of the disk drive that was a little on the rush side. This is representing the dust. Airflow traveling through the heatsink hits the dust and goes around and out the fan. This causes the chips to run excessively hot because the heat coming out of the chip can no longer, or is no longer, being pulled off the heatsink. This causes the chip to run excessively hot, crystallizing and eventually cracking solder joints beneath on the chip, or the solder balls beneath the chip. Alright, now it also will dry out the thermal paste beneath the heat sinks. Now, a lot of these videos claim that the X clamps, as depicted here in this black, is the flaw of the box. Absolutely incorrect. The heat sink and legs go all the way through the motherboard and is attached directly to the case with a T8 Torx screw. This prevents the heat sink from moving whatsoever. There is no flexing, there is no anything, okay? The heat sink is perfectly seated on the chip. Now, the X clamp itself does provide tension by the curl on the end of the clamp, which holds the motherboard up, and this black plastic tab here, which acts as a center board support. Okay, it also holds the X clamp on during assembly so that it don't fall off while it's going down the assembly line before it's put into the case. But once it's in the case, it acts as a board support. Alright, if you wrap your box in a towel, you will melt this portion, causing the motherboard to loosen and cause a gap between the portion of the chip and the heat sink. So absolutely not do that. Okay, first of all, if you wrap it in a towel, you're not correcting the issue of the dust. Okay, so you need to open the box, clean the dust out, and properly repair the box. You cannot do that by unplugging the fans. There is no difference between unplugging the fans and wrapping your box in a towel. Let me correct that. The one difference between unplugging the fans and wrapping your box in a towel is when you wrap your box in a towel, you damage your disk drive. There's a lot of plastic parts in there, and this thing will get up to almost 200 degrees or more, depending on how hot it gets, and it will warp, and you will wind up with open tray issues as well. Not to mention causing 60 times more damage to the solder beneath your chips than what you had before you started. Okay, so let's take a look here. You notice these legs. You see this bolt section? This is what they use to attach the leg to the heatsink. This is 2 millimeters high. You'll notice if you open up your 360 before ever doing any kind of bolting to it, that there is a gap between it and the motherboard. when they put the two 1mm washers here, it's the exact same height as this, right? Which means when they sandwich that down, it's going to cause this part of the board to bow. We're going to take a look at that in a new slide here. Let me switch. There we go. Alright, now notice we got bolts now, and if they get the tension just right and they get it to sit perfectly flush, which is extremely difficult with the bolts because it is not all that easy to get it to perfectly sit, but let's say they did. There will be a little bit of a gap between these two washers and these two washers in the motherboard. Okay? But now you're free from the case. This allows the motherboard itself to, next time the dust builds up on the heat sink, to flex. In other words, it will bow upward because of the heat of the box. This will crack solder joints in other locations of your box, in most cases causing a permanent damage to the box, and I'll explain the permanent damage shortly thereafter. And let's say it didn't bow, but it did recrystallize and crack the solder, because over a period of time these bolts will become loose again because there is no longer a board support here holding the chip in place. This will begin to sag due to the heat weakening the material. Alright, this will cause a gap right about through here and through here, causing a hot spot, causing these to melt because they're hot. This will cause an even more of a bow. They'll eventually crystallize and crack. Let's say they did use a BGA welder, they did everything perfect, and they got it just like this. Everything's perfect. Next time it overheats, this will loosen up. Over a period of time of playing, it'll loosen up, and because of the board sag and the flexing and pulling of the board, because it's no longer attached, it will loosen the contact between the chip and the heat sink and recrystallize the solder because it is now running hotter, because there's no longer any good thermal conductivity between the chip and the heat sinks. Okay, which would act the same as the dust not pulling the heat off of the heat sink. Alright, now this will crack, and what they will do is they'll come back and they will tighten these screws that they put in here up again. Okay, and this will cause even more tension on the chips, and I'm going to show you that in a minute, but I wanted to show you, I wanted to touch on you as to why this is like this. A lot of people use the heat guns when they reflow these, and they'll also use the heat gun on these chips here. These chips very rarely, if ever, go bad unless somebody has used a heat gun on it. Okay, so do not use a heat gun on these chips unless you know for a fact it's that chip and somebody else has done a heat gun trick on it. You definitely want to use a BGA welder, because if you get 1 or 2 degrees too high, these little solder balls are underneath here are going to pop and melt into each other and cause a permanent red light issue that requires a total reball of that chip, which is extremely not a fun and easy thing to do. Okay, same goes with this Vigor chip, which has 2,000 plus solder balls underneath it. Anyhow, I can give you the exact numbers, but I just don't remember them right off the top of my head. Okay, now let's see what happens when they retighten these bolts. Okay, here we go. The bolts have been tightened for a second repair by the YouTube repairman. Now the two 1mm washers are holding the motherboard, and the bolt is sandwiching the motherboard, pulling the motherboard upward, causing it to bow, separating the center portion of the chip as well, causing hot spots. The heat is now only transferring from the outside edges of the chip and the center portion of the chip is now running burning hot. This makes the second repair last even less in time. Okay, this less amount of time is in direct result due to the hot spots caused by this, which can become a permanent overheating issue if it bows enough to where the gap is such that it is not able to cool, and would become a permanent overheating issue even if you replace the X clamp, because now the chip itself has become bowed with the motherboard due to them overheating the box with the heatsink on it under pressure. Okay, now you notice that I have a little gap between these solder balls here and over here. This is why. We're going to go to the next slide. Okay, we have components on the board with trace lines that go up under the chip and then through the chip and out to other components. Well, what the vast majority of these people doing these repairs don't understand, that with the bolt method you have this. This is the motherboard. I'm going to have to pause this to get the answer. Okay, I'm back. I meant the phone, not the answer machine. Anyway, let's take a look. The vertical trace lines, or I should say the component lines, go along the top side of the box to the solder pad that the solder ball rests on, which is attached to the chip. What they don't understand is there is a vertical trace line that runs straight down through the motherboard to contacts on the opposite side of the board, which then in turn go to components which will either go back to another solder ball back into the chip or off to another component. Oops, wrong one. Should have had it on pencil. Yeah, off to another component somewhere else. Alright, and when this board bows down like this, because they've just tightened these things up, this is what happens. Okay, the solder ball 98% of the time will yank the contact off of the green portion of the board, breaking that vertical trace, because it will not flex or pull off of the green portion of the board and stay connected like the trace lines that run along the top. They have a little bit of room to flex because they can pull off the board, but the vertical trace line is set through the board and has no room for flexing, bowing, anything like that. So once it comes off, even the tiniest amount will snap that vertical trace line, and now you have a permanent non-repairable box. There is just no way to reattach that little tiny vertical trace line whatsoever. So that is exactly why I say do not ever allow anyone to put bolts in your box. Anybody who would like to make a video and try to convince me of an alternative or how this is not happening, then by all means do it. But I would also like to see your background in electronics. Okay? But I would be more than happy to entertain any of your bullshit claims about the bolting method being an acceptable method of repair for any reason whatsoever. Thank you very much, and good day to you, and happy gaming to all of those of you who have found this video, and do not allow the bolts to be put in the box.